Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 23rd day of February in the year 2016. It is a pleasure to be with you on a Tuesday, and of course you appreciate, I'm sure, the fact that we are beginning our program 1/2 hour later on, as we usually do on Tuesdays. So our program will be an abbreviated one today. We will only be on for 90 minutes, an hour and a half, rather than our regular 2-hour format, which we follow on Mondays and Wednesdays. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I kind of considered yesterday a day to get the brugs out and get rid of a little bit of the rustiness and things, and about having been away for so long. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate your continued support for the Virtual Center and for the Head On Radio Network. As we continue our programs, as we move through the weeks and months, of course, it becomes more and more clear to me, especially at the height of this political season, how very, very important it is to maintain this progressive voice that comes to us courtesy of the Head On Radio Network. And so I do encourage all of those who can to try to shake a dollar or two loose if possible and support Bob Kincaid and his folks in their effort to keep this program on the air, because it is so very, very important. And you know, over the years, I've done a lot of fundraising for public broadcasting, and public broadcasting relies on its viewers for support. The fact of the matter is, public broadcasting also gets foundation support and political support from state governments as well, and I'm sure you know that. The reason I mention that is because the Head On Radio Network is 100% dependent on support from its listeners. So I think it's very, very important to make that point, and I want you to know how much we, and myself included, appreciate your continued support of the Head On Radio Network, and especially, of course, the support that you've given me in our efforts here at the Virtual Center. We would love to hear from you if you are so inclined to share your thoughts and your ideas, your concerns, questions, suggestions, or whatever. We would love to hear from you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me directly via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906, that's all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And I do remind you again of our Facebook page. We've had the Facebook page up now for 3 or 4 months. And I think we continue to get new viewers. Of course, the folks at Facebook keep account of the new viewers who take a look at our Facebook page, and it seems like a day doesn't go by where there's an additional 1 or 2 new people looking at our Facebook page, and I appreciate that. So if you go to Facebook, if you are a regular Facebook user, if you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page, and I try to post items of opinion items and things of interest that I think are appropriate for our Facebook page on the Virtual Center. And what I've begun to do recently, and I just did this morning, I posted the transcript, the audio archived recording of yesterday's program on the Facebook page. So if you go to the Facebook page, you will see as the first item on the page beyond the introductory material, an account, a link to yesterday's program. And in the write-up associated with that on the Facebook page, I kind of summarized yesterday's program by pointing out that the first hour of the program focused principally on issues related to the psychology of learning. And what we talked about, as you recall, is those who find themselves challenged, and I consider myself to be a leader in this, technology challenged, as it were, and how one particular approach to learning in our technological age is being featured over others. And for those who find that particular approach to learning a little bit difficult, it's extremely frustrating. It can be, and I know it has been for me at times and continues to be at times as well. So our first hour yesterday focused principally on that, and I made mention of the very popular program questionnaire or survey that's out there now on the right brain, left brain issue in order to determine the psychology, whether in fact one is driven more by the analytic side of the brain, the left brain, or the more creative, artistic side, which is the right brain. And we talked quite a bit about that in our first hour yesterday. And then in our second hour yesterday, we began to deal with the issue of religious freedom, more specifically the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that is currently in the hopper here in our West Virginia legislative session, as it is in a number of other states as well. Made reference to the fact that the legislation is very, very similar to the legislation passed in the state of Indiana last year and pushed through by its governor, Michael Pence, and the extent to which the state, because of the discrimination aspects, potential of the legislation, the state of Indiana estimates that it lost in the neighborhood of $60 million in conference and convention center business last year, because businesses were reluctant to come to Indiana for fear that this legislation would subject them to some sort of discrimination lawsuit. And this particular, and the point is that the state of Indiana rescinded the legislation as a result. Now West Virginia is considering that. It passed the House of Delegates here in West Virginia on the 11th day of February, and it moved then to the Senate. And there is quite a bit of controversy about it in the Senate. And as far as I know, it has not passed the Senate as yet. And of course, chances are that if it goes to the governor of the state of West Virginia, it could be vetoed. But here in West Virginia, the veto basically is meaningless, since there is not a two-thirds override vote required, but only a majority vote. In a sense, then, if a piece of legislation passes the legislature, then all it has to do is pass it a second time, and the veto is overwritten. So, in effect, vetoing legislation here in the state of Virginia has become rather a rather routine and insignificant task. One of the things, and Bob Kincaid and I were chatting about this before we went on the air today, and I just wanted to make a mention or two. I'd like to, if I can, in coming days and weeks, maybe spend a little bit more time in this. But one of the things that I'm beginning to pick up as I try to get back into my regular routine in terms of reading various publications around the country on some of the issues of the day, there's quite a bit of coverage of late suggesting or raising serious questions about the Bernie Sanders campaign in terms of its economic program proposals. The suggestions are to put it succinctly, the suggestions are coming from a number of different directions, economists and others, that to use the very popular phrase, the numbers don't seem to add up. That in effect, what's being argued is that many of the proposals that Bernie Sanders is suggesting as part of his campaign, free community colleges and all the rest of it, don't add up, and that the the deficit budget shortfall would be much, much greater than Bernie Sanders is anticipating, even though the arguments that even Bernie Sanders subscribes to are significant budget shortfalls in the short term. It seems like, I know that Fareed Zakaria has wrote a piece in the Washington Post, which was republished in our local Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia, suggesting that while there are serious questions about the economic proposals of a number of the Republican candidates, the fact of the matter is, in contrast with the deficit numbers, the debt numbers that are associated with Bernie Sanders' recommendations, the Republican shortfalls seem to pale in comparison. I read 2 or 3 pieces this morning on this, and a few days ago there was an op-ed piece written by a number of prominent economists, progressive economists, Democratic economists, questioning some of the economic numbers in Bernie Sanders' package. I think it's important to recognize, and this is the only thing that I would say at this point, because I haven't really had time to pull it together, and very honestly, I don't consider myself that qualified in terms of doing the kinds of research necessary to demonstrate that the numbers do add up or that the numbers don't add up. Like most of us, I think I'm kind of subject to the people who do this for a living. I'm pretty well dependent on their conclusions as to whether, in fact, the numbers add up or don't add up. But the one thing that I do want to make reference to here today is the fact that many of the people who are arguing that those numbers do not add up are people who don't want those numbers to add up. And I think it's important to recognize that. There's no question that, as we saw in the Nevada caucuses on Saturday in the Hillary Clinton victory there, the establishment, so-called, is beginning to take the Bernie Sanders candidacy very, very seriously. And they are beginning to recognize that the degree of support that Bernie Sanders has been able to generate, especially among young people, is much stronger than they ever dreamed possible. And so consequently, as we all appreciate, Bernie Sanders has been giving Hillary Clinton's campaign a run for her money, a serious run for her money. And as we mentioned yesterday in our first hour, right up until the very day of the election, of the primary election itself in Nevada, there was some question. The polls were suggesting that Bernie Sanders could even win Nevada, when in fact a month ago he was 20 points behind. So in a sense, a lot of people did not give the Bernie Sanders campaign nearly the credit or the serious attention that it has since indicated that it warranted. And now a lot of these people are beginning to take the Sanders candidacy seriously, and they're fighting back. And the fact of the matter is, many of these so-called progressive economists who are challenging Bernie Sanders' economic proposals are people who support the establishment, the Hillary Clinton candidacy in the Democratic Party. So I think it's important to recognize that. And there's one other thing, and I didn't read this anyway. This is just my own observation for whatever it's worth. What Bernie Sanders is proposing when he talks about a revolution, a political revolution, I'm not sure that a lot of people don't conclude that that's merely campaign rhetoric, that he's just using the word revolution in its political context. The fact of the matter is, the Bernie Sanders campaign is indeed moving in the direction of what promises to be a political revolution, should it end up proving to be successful. What I mean by that is that the traditional way that people have put together the numbers for however long ago we go back would seriously change. Because what the campaign that Bernie Sanders is running is talking about is not just the cost of free community college tuition, the cost of creating 13 million well-paying jobs with benefits, putting millions of people back to work on the infrastructure in our country. A lot of people are just adding up the prospective or potential costs of these programs and are concluding that this promises to produce a huge deficit. The fact of the matter is, what Bernie Sanders' campaign is proposing is a total shift in not only the economic priorities, but the political priorities of this nation. What I mean is that while Republicans continue to challenge the legitimacy of government itself and continue to send out the political message that the ideal goal of conservatives is to render government impotent in order to return power to the people, so-called. The fact of the matter is, a lot of this is rhetoric, because clearly we know that the issue is not getting rid of government. And we touched on this yesterday, and I'll get back to it in a moment. But the fact of the matter is, this business of reducing government's influence in society to the point that government is rendered impotent is an illusion. It's a political facade. It's mythology. The issue is not the elimination of government. The real issue is the priority of government. Government's importance in the areas of economic development will not be reduced significantly. That's not really the issue. The issue is where government support will be focused. For as far back as we can remember, government's priority has been to support business, has been to support the private sector. All the tax cuts in our so-called progressive tax legislation, all of these loopholes, so-called, were created with the idea of stimulating government expansion and business expansion and business confidence, so that opportunities would be generated for economic expansion, growth, job creation, and all the rest of it. And what has happened in recent years is that business has taken advantage of this largesse, this political largesse that has been thrust upon the business sector. And corporate America, to a large degree, has chosen to take the money out of the economy and put it in private investments located overseas and tax-sheltered accounts and all the rest of it. In other words, business has, for a number of reasons which it can best explain, has chosen to not reinvest the profits that it is making back into the economy, but rather to pull profit out of the economy. And at the same time, to create the economic slowdown in the expansion of jobs and blame government for that. What Bernie Sanders is proposing is a total shift in priorities, which would mean that government's definition of the public interest is going to change. The focus of government attention is going to be on the citizens at large rather than on the private sector, which has taken unfair advantage of the opportunities that it has been rendered. The point I'm trying to make is, with this kind of a sea change in the way government regularly does business, The old way of adding up the numbers no longer applies, it seems to me. It seems to me we're talking about a situation which we have not experienced before. We really don't know what the overall impact on the numbers is going to be if indeed the kinds of things that Bernie Sanders is proposing were to happen. We don't know what kind of economic growth and expansion could happen if millions of people were suddenly put into the workforce and became viable taxpayers and investors in economic expansion and economic growth. We don't even know what the impact of that will be. We don't know what it would mean if the cost of government subsidy for health care and many of the other things for our poorest citizens was removed from the occasion because many of these so-called poorest citizens became self-employed and became self-sufficient, which is what Bernie Sanders is talking about. We don't know what it would mean if the government costs of the war on drugs suddenly began to disappear because the worst elements of our drug problem began to disappear as people were able to find meaningful work. What Bernie Sanders is talking about is a revolution. And the fact of the matter is, if that revolution were to happen, the traditional way of adding up the numbers will no longer matter, will no longer be effective. Most of the critics of the Sanders proposals at this point are using formulas and number systems which are generated in the economy as it's traditionally operated. What Bernie Sanders is talking about is a totally new operation in our economic system. So again, I wouldn't be too quick to buy into much of the criticisms of the Sanders economic system. I'm not an economist, but I do recognize the makings of a political revolution when I see one. And that's what I'm seeing in the campaign that Bernie Sanders is running. And I think to try to exaggerate the size of the deficit and then suggest that the economy as we've always known it cannot sustain that kind of a deficit implies that the economy as we've always known it is going to be the economy that continues. It is not. What the Sanders campaign is focusing on is a totally different kind of economic system from what has been tried up to this point. And I think, should it happen, we're going to have to come up with a whole new way of cranking the numbers in order to determine what will work and what will not. The one thing that's clear is that the Sanders campaign recognizes the opportunities associated with debt. This idea of balanced budgets and all of this is a strategy. Basically, it's a favorite argument of those at the top. It has been traditionally used all the way back into the colonial period and the early history of this nation. The assumption that budgets must balance is a way to keep government from supporting those elements in the economy which heretofore have never been supported. Those are the elements that Bernie Sanders is talking about now. Job creation, economic benefits, meaningful jobs, an increase in the minimum wage, meaningful benefits for people, a meaningful retirement system for people who work through their lives. Health care. that people can depend on and don't need to worry about as wiping them out, which is what so many people are feeling of the threat of today, and many of these other things. In other words, all I'm saying is that when Bernie Sanders talks about a political revolution in this country, I think it's important that people recognize exactly the degree to which what he's proposing is indeed revolutionary. I think we need to know that. We need to recognize then that when you support Bernie Sanders, you're supporting things that promise a degree of change that many of us in our lifetimes have never seen before. And I personally think it's kind of exciting. But be that as it may, I just felt like I ought to say something because I'm reading so much about the numbers not adding up. And of course, I don't have the expertise to determine whether, in fact, the numbers adding up or not adding up is meaningful. I know that about 2 years ago, I wrote a piece that appeared in one of our local papers here about the cost of health care. And it was during the period when so many people were talking about the need to get a grip, to get a handle on the escalating costs of health care in America. This was prior to the Affordable Care Act. It was during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, as I recall. One of the things that became very clear to me as I began to do a little bit of research in preparation for this piece is that there's absolutely no way to accurately determine the cost of health care because the prices being charged for health care bear little to no relationship at all to the actual costs of delivery. Healthcare costs are being inflated to a degree that is absolutely obscene. Because ultimately what we have here is a tremendously large, somewhat invisible shifting of costs from those who can't pay to those who can pay. And the fact of the matter is those who can pay for health care, those who can afford meaningful insurance, health insurance, are experiencing inflated costs in order to pay for the health care needs, services generated to those who cannot pay for their own health care, those on Medicaid, for example. It's cost shifting to a degree that most of us would find abhorrent if we were fully aware of it. It's not an accident that we're not aware of it. So the fact of the matter is, the only way that we could get a real handle on the cost of health care is to change the system in such a way that everybody had to pay the cost of the health care that they were getting, an accurate cost, in order to figure out what that cost is. I don't think anybody in the field or in government wants the general public to have any idea as to what the real cost of health care are. $1,100, $1,200 for blood tests. I had myself had a medical procedure several weeks ago. My insurance is being billed something in the area of $5,000 for that procedure. It was a half an hour procedure. It took a half an hour. And to assume that the cost of that was $5,000, that's what insurance is being charged. But I would suggest to you that was not the cost of the procedure. That's the point I'm trying to make. So we are operating in a world which we do not understand. So when the people on top of that world are telling us that the numbers don't add up, we need to appreciate the fact that too often the numbers are meaningless anyway. So whatever. Anyway, I didn't mean to spend, I've pretty much eaten up the first half hour of our program today on that, and I didn't mean to do that. We have just passed the top of the hour. It's 2 minutes after the hour, 2 minutes after 2 p.m. here in the East, so we've got a full hour to go in today's program, and I want to basically return to the issue of religious freedom, and more specifically, I want to devote our attention to James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance on Religious Freedom, which was written in June of 1785 in the state of Virginia. And it clearly becomes the model for the religious freedom provisions in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. Madison wrote this remonstrance in 1785, and Madison was the one given the principal responsibility of crafting the First Amendment. So I think it's important to recognize that Madison's approach to religious freedom, as articulated in 1785 in his remonstrance, is indeed the approach to freedom that is written into the First Amendment in our Bill of Rights. And I think it's important to know that. I'd like to begin. I don't want to spend a lot of time going over what we did yesterday because a lot of it was West Virginia specific. It was dealing specifically with the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act that is currently under in operation here, or in our legislature here in the state of West Virginia. But one thing that came up yesterday, and at the end of the day, after the program, on thinking back, I began to realize that I probably didn't give this as much emphasis or as much attention as it warrants. So I'd like to begin today by going back to that particular point. And it's a point that actually I made a little bit earlier in the comments that I was making about Bernie Sanders' economic programs. And it deals with the issue of government and the size of government and how aggressive or how visible government is in its inclusion in a nation's economy, in a nation's way of life. There's no question that if you listen to the conservative positions that are being put forth by the major candidates, Republican candidates for president, one would conclude legitimately that conservatism, as it's being defined by all of the Republican candidates, amounts, although it has different emphases or different nuances depending on who's saying it. Generally, it seems to me, one might conclude that the definition of conservatism in today's world is linked to the minimizing of the role of government in our day-to-day lives. The move towards the calling of an Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution. Approaches to religious freedom. Concerns about budget deficits. All of these things suggest that government is going way beyond its legitimate functions, and that it is on a wild spending spree, which is spending government, spending this nation into financial disaster. The implication is that if conservatives are able to rein in that spending, we can somehow get government back, get that genie back into the bottle, so to speak. Rein in government and reduce its influence in society to the influence that the founders expected and hoped it would have. That, I would suggest to you, seems to be the message that conservatives are sending to the American people. The implication then that most citizens draw is that to vote Republican or to vote conservative is to vote for the minimizing of government's influence. The assumption being that as government influence goes down, the freedom of citizens goes up. In other words, the idea that government, the size and influence of government, and the extent of individual freedom in our society are inversely proportional to each other. The bigger and more active government is, the less freedom people have, the thinking goes. The opposite suggests that if you limit government, if you reduce its spending, if you so-called starve the beast by refusing to give it the funds it needs to continue the spending that it's doing, that by reining in government this way, you are somehow promoting the freedom of individuals. It's important for us to recognize that this is not real, that this is a false implication or suggestion. We are not talking about reducing the influence of government, getting government out of the economy. Government is the economy. Roads, canals, infrastructure, investments, banks, overseas trade, international trade, all of these things are generated by and include the operations of government. So we're not talking about taking government out of those areas. What we're talking about doing is shifting the emphasis or the priorities of government. It's not a question of reducing government so much as it is reallocating or redirecting government's influence to different outcomes, different objectives. In the area of religious freedom, for example, when Madison's talking about religious freedom, he's not talking about making government, in other words, making it impossible for government to infringe on the freedom of people to worship as they choose to worship, or not worship at all if they choose to do that. That's not what he's talking about. What Madison is talking about is not allowing government to get into areas that it really has no business being in. We're not talking about reducing the size of government. We're talking about redirecting its priorities and its emphases. In today's world, the debates continually revolve around the issues of right to life and abortions and Planned Parenthood and all of these other, religious freedom and all of these other issues. Madison's point is that these are divisive issues. They are not conducive to compromise. They are not conducive to negotiation. They are not conducive to consensus building. Therefore, by definition, they are areas that government has no business even being in. These are private citizens' business, and they shouldn't involve government at all. Consequently, Madison's definition of religious freedom is keeping government, keeping the state out of religion entirely. Madison's argument or thinking is that when the state becomes involved in any way in religion, religious freedom as we know it is in jeopardy. And it's important to recognize the difference. We're not talking about reducing government's influence. We're talking about defining more precisely where government ought to be involved and where it should not. And Madison's position is that government ought not to be involved in religion at all. The mere fact that government becomes involved means that the beginnings of real danger to religious freedom are in jeopardy. And in fact, the reason I believe that this is such an important issue, and it's worth so much time here at the Virtual Center, is because while Madison is speaking about religious freedom, the fact of the matter is we're really talking about individual freedom generally here. When government becomes involved and it begins to favor particular points of view or particular groups of people, that affects other people. The more the state is involved in these kinds of issues, the more damage is done to those people that the state is not supporting. So it's not a question. If you remember, in 1785, the legislation that prompted Madison's remonstrance in the first place was a tax on the citizens of the state of Virginia to support public morality. Who can be against public morality? In West Virginia here, earlier this month, the House of Delegates voted 72 to 26, I believe, in support of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. In West Virginia politics, what politician in his right mind is going to go on record voting against a piece of legislation that has the name religious freedom in it? It would be political suicide. But the fact of the matter is, naming the legislation religious freedom is deceptive. It's duplicitous. Because what it does is bring the state into matters of religion when traditionally in our society religious freedom is built around keeping the state out of religious areas totally. So I think this is the important issue. And this is what we need to recognize. We're not talking about eliminating government's influence. We're talking about redirecting it, getting it out of certain areas, focusing on those areas where government ought to be active and ought to be involved, and taking it out of areas where it ought not. Madison's position is that in building community or consensus, in bringing people together in our society, government must avoid those areas and those issues which are potentially divisive. And there's no more potentially divisive issue than religion. The only way, as Madison said in his remonstrance, to guarantee the religious freedom of everybody is to make sure that government does not affect religion in any way for anybody. Every denomination, every religious group would like to have the power to get the state on its side. But the fact of the matter is, since no religious group has the power to do that, the only alternative they have is to make sure that nobody else ever gets that power either. In other words, if I can't have the power to do it to you, then I better make sure that you never have the power to do it to me. And if we both recognize that, then we both recognize that our own freedom is best protected by keeping the state totally out of the pulpit, out of the church entirely. And that's the crux of Madison's approach.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
to religious freedom. Yes, Bob.
May I ask a question?
Sure, you certainly may.
And I address this specifically to West Virginia and more rural, perhaps more southern states. Why do you suppose it is that people have a far easier time embracing and understanding gun rights than they do religious rights? And work with me here for just a second.
Okay, go ahead.
If you were to talk to a room full of West Virginians, and you said, now, you want your Second Amendment right to be absolute, don't you? Yes. Right?
Right.
So you don't want the government favoring 44 Magnums over 357 Magnums or 270s over 30-06s.
Okay.
And you certainly don't want the government saying you just flat out can't have an AK-47.
Right.
And their answer, right. Well, then why are you okay with the government favoring one religion over another?
That's a good point.
They are both constitutional rights. They are equal. You know, the Bill of Rights is not numbered in order of importance. Okay. And if it was, religious freedom would be more important than gun freedom.
Right. Right.
But if you're okay with monkeying with one constitutional right, be forewarned. That means you're going to be okay with monkeying with another one.
With another one, exactly.
And that applies to a woman's right to choose, too.
It does. That's Madison's point, is that these areas which are potentially so divisive are all areas that government ought not to be in at all. But on the other hand, on the issue of guns, Bob, I think that the assumption that religious freedom as a fundamental right, as an unalienable right, and gun rights are the same. That's the result of Heller. But I just cannot accept the fact that that's real.
Well, I understand,
in terms of the debate, in terms of the argument you're making, you're exactly right.
Well, I mean, we could say to that same group of West Virginians, okay, everybody likes Smith & Wesson because it's made in America, right?
Right.
Well, does that mean that you don't want any Walthers brought in? You don't want any Sig Sauers brought in? They're excellent firearms, among the best in the world. The best Brownings were originally built in Belgium. Well, then, how is it that you want to say that one religion is better than another religion?
Right.
And let me and if I could please, I want to ask this question as well because it occurred to me earlier. We have often acknowledged the shortcomings or the blind spots of the framers. It is safe to assume that when Madison is writing about freedom of religion, he doesn't give a tinker's damn about the religions of the indigenous peoples, does he?
No.
So, and I think you and I would probably agree that whenever one of these right-wingers says America is a Christian, was founded as a Christian nation, we both, and people who actually understand the framing of the Constitution, no, it wasn't. And point out, Franklin's agnosticism, the deism of Jefferson and Madison and Washington.
Right.
There were definitely, the Danbury Baptists were very, very, very definitely Christians. And there were Anglicans and Catholics and Quakers.
Right.
And there were Jews.
Right.
And one presumes, a couple of Muslims. So is it safe to make that assumption, Dr. Bill, that Madison was talking about various forms of Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox, that he was talking about Judaism and Islam?
I think given, I know in Jefferson's case, for example, Jefferson did deal with when he was on office as president, with the Barbary pirates who were Muslims, but I don't believe that there was any recognition of the religious rights of the indigenous peoples who were here prior to the Western settlement. I agree with you. But I think that when we emerged as a nation that was receiving people from all over the world, totally diverse cultures and nationalities, the model that Madison adopted for preserving the freedom of these people is essentially is essentially guaranteed by limiting government to those areas which could build consensus and unity among these competing different kinds of people, rather than government becoming involved in the things which potentially divided these people.
Well, and knowing how Madison felt about faction, can't you imagine that he was sitting there just imagining the Baptists at the throats of the Methodists, at the throats of the Lutherans, at the throats of the Presbyterians, at the throats of the Anglicans, at the throats of the Quakers, who are never at anybody's throats.
Right.
And thinking, yeah, this is going to be great.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's politics is not the ultimate faction.
No.
Religion is.
Religion is. That's right. And it's potentially and ultimately the greatest, most divisive issue in our society, and it's the one that Madison was most concerned about, was keeping government out of the churches and the pulpits, and thereby guaranteeing. And that was the model was Pennsylvania, because William Penn opened up, in order to attract settlers, William Penn offered land and opportunity to anyone who would come, as long as they believed in God. As long, that was the only requirement. But whether they were Methodists or Quakers or whatever, didn't matter.
One wonders how he would have felt about a Muslim.
But one wonders, indeed.
Because, of course, we know that he was open and accepting of Jews.
Right.
Because
right.
Ben Franklin had like some sort of honorary membership to the synagogue in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, which was one of the largest in the country at the time, I think.
These people were incredibly, what we would call today, liberal people in a lot of ways, and not exclusively, but in a lot of ways. I mean, granted, they didn't recognize the rights of the indigenous people because they didn't consider them to be
people.
To be people, exactly. But within those that they did consider to be people, what they were looking for was strategies to bring these different divisive groups together so that they could all live together in peace and harmony and work together and respect.
And not murder each other in their sleep. Exactly.
And what we're doing today is we're injecting government into the most volatile, explosive, divisive, dangerous areas. When life begins, when life ends, all of these other things that we're doing. In other words, we're just asking for trouble.
Well, I don't know. Did you catch the one Gazette op-ed piece by the Methodist minister? Who, I mean, he wrote it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but he sort of said, "Oh, yoo-hoo, Christians, you do realize that it's going to be okay under this religious freedom bill to discriminate against you, don't you?"
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. That's the whole issue. Once the state is in there, discrimination becomes a reality. And that's why to enlist the state as an agent to support religious freedom is a contradiction. It literally violates religious freedom as it's traditionally been practiced and accepted in this nation. It's unbelievable, and people obviously need to appreciate that. It's not a question of reducing government so it can't interfere. It's the fact that where government does and does not become involved needs to be more precisely defined, and it seems to me where we're in trouble. And when Donald Trump talks about When I come, all the Muslims are going, we're not going to have any more Muslims in here. We're going to build a wall, not let any more Mexicans in here and all. And when people say this violates the traditions of this nation, I don't really think that they appreciate the degree to which it really does.
Oh, it absolutely does. I mean,
absolutely.
Thomas Jefferson, as you well know, Thomas Jefferson's book collection, his own personal library, formed the nucleus of the Young Library of Congress.
Right, it sure did.
And what was in there? The very first copy of the Quran ever brought into the young United States.
That's right.
And Keith Ellison took his oath of office on it, much to the screaming dismay of various members of the ignoranti.
Right. You're right, Bob. You're right. This is really incredible stuff. This document by Madison is because he just goes through one argument after the other to make the case as to why we don't want to do this.
Do you think, and who knows, you may get the opportunity. Do you think you could explain this in such a way to, and I'm saying this, okay, I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but do you think you could explain this to a room full of West Virginia hayshakers and Bible bangers and have them walk away going, that O'Brien fella's right?
I don't know, Bob. And the reason is because these people are not there because they want to know. These people are there because they want reinforcement for the fact that they already know. And so what you'd have to do is basically shake their faith in what they already know. That would have to happen first. In other words, the absurdities of, the lengths to which what they currently believe could lead to. The nose under the tent idea that Madison raises here. Once you begin to discriminate against one group, there's nothing to prevent you from discriminating against other groups. And everybody pays lip service to this, but people I don't think people appreciate how real it is. So,
do they realize? I mean, there's economic impacts too. Do we really want the full fury of boycott activities to be dropped on West Virginia's ever so fragile economy like it was on Indiana's?
On Indiana's, exactly.
And see, Indiana's got a more diverse economy than we do.
That's right. And they clearly could absorb a $60 million shortfall over this particular legislation, but I don't think under the present circumstances West Virginia can take any more hits on its. I mean, this is going to backfire, and businesses were not going into Indiana clearly because they didn't want to be sued. And what you had these extremists, religious extremists in Virginia, saying we're not going to bake a cake for this gay couple wanting to get married because it violates my sense of religious freedom to be a participant in a marriage ceremony which I don't accept as legitimate.
Well, and again, I come back to the principle: what happens when your baker says, "Oh, I'm sorry, you want a wedding cake for a reception at a Baptist church?"
Right.
That supported this bigotry bill.
Right.
I'm terribly sorry. You'll have to go somewhere else.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm gay.
That's right.
Well, and I can't have you eating gay wedding cake at your good, upstanding, fine, God-fearing, Bible-believing Baptist church. Now, can we?
No, exactly.
And you know what? There's a campaign that's starting in this state, and I think, unless I'm mistaken, it'll feature the outline of the state of West Virginia with a rainbow superimposed upon it, and it will say simply, "All are welcome."
Yeah.
And that is the sweet, gentle, loving, dare I say it, Christian way to go about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I don't think the people that want this bill are going to understand until it is put in their face. Not so much all are welcome, but you're not welcome.
You're not welcome. Exactly. The mere fact that the state has the power to tell people that they are welcome means that it also has the power to tell certain people that they are not.
And what these fundamentalists have done is open up the door to finding themselves unwelcome.
Exactly.
Because they think they're a majority that they really aren't. For instance, one of the most visible people advancing this insanity is a character by the name of Tom Fast here out of Fayette County.
Right.
And he was on the floor of the House predicting that if we protect gay rights, the next thing you know, we'll have to protect polygamist rights, which is just nuts.
Yeah.
But what he made it into office, and this is a larger important civic aspect to all of this. He was put into office by 15.1% of the electorate.
Yeah. And that's the size, the issue of voter turnout. That if
but it also tells you what the strength and power is,
right,
of these people who are doing this sort of stuff.
Right.
They are not nearly as powerful as they think they are.
Oh.
What they always need is low voter turnout.
Right.
And for good people, as the saying goes, to do nothing. So I'll hush now and let you go on about your business.
You're exactly right, Bob. Thank you. I appreciate that so very much. I wanted to deal with some of Madison's arguments because I think they're so good, and it gets us right back to the actual texts themselves. And this particular piece of legislation, Madison's so-called Memorial and Remonstrance on Religious Freedom, Madison deals with 15 specific arguments as to why we don't want a law like this, which is a tax to support public morality, which in effect would be a tax that went into the coffers of the most dominant, powerful religious entity in the state, which was the Anglican Church. And so Madison's argument was that the supporters of the Anglican Church were pushing this legislation for their own advantage, but the way they were covering it or covering up their self-interest was to claim that the purpose of the legislation was to promote or strengthen public morality. But in effect, what that meant was public morality as it's defined by the Anglican Church in the state of Virginia. And that was the thing that caused Madison and Jefferson both to oppose it. Madison writes in June of 1785, this is in his papers, it's dated the 20th of June, 1785, and it's a remonstrance addressed to the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in the name of the citizens, Madison writes, "We the subscribers, citizens of the said Commonwealth, having taken into serious consideration a bill printed by order of the last session of General Assembly entitled, A Bill Establishing a Provision for Teachers of the Christian Religion, and conceiving that the same, if finally armed with the sanctions of a law, will be a dangerous abuse of power, are bound as faithful members of a free state to remonstrate against it, and to declare the reasons by which we are determined. We remonstrate against the said bill because," and then follows 15 specific becauses. Here's the first one, and just listen to the rationale that Madison is laying out here. "We oppose this bill, first," Madison says, "because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth, quote, that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence," unquote. And that phrase, that quotation, that religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. That quotation is from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It is Article 16 in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was passed by the colony of Virginia, or actually by the newly declared independent state of Virginia in 1776, at the same time as the Declaration. So Madison is saying, we oppose this bill because we accept it as a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion must be determined or driven by reason and conviction, not by force or by violence. The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. It is unalienable also because what is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. Madison's argument then is that if you believe that what man believes in terms of religion must come from within him, then you must oppose every challenge to that. You must oppose every piece of legislation that would dictate that truth can come from someplace else other than from within every individual man. The minute you accept the fact that truth can come from somewhere else, from outside, from a law, then you are denying the unalienable right of men to discover truth for themselves. You are denying them a right that presumably you had. You found the truth. And now you are moving to impose your definition of truth on other people and thereby denying them the opportunity to discover it for themselves? Madison's argument is that's a violation of every man's unalienable right to pursue truth for himself. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. It's also unalienable because what is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. In other words, if you believe in God, God gave you a mind so that you could find truth. And by supporting a law like this one, you are infringing on the Creator's strategy for giving man the unalienable right to find truth for himself. You are denying other men that right by imposing your definition of truth and demanding that they accept yours rather than pursue it for themselves. Madison says it is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent, both in order of time and in degree of obligation, to the claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered a member of civil society who enters into any subordinate association must always do it with a reservation of his duty to the general authority. Much more must every man who becomes a member of any particular civil society do it with a saving of his allegiance to the universal sovereign. Basically, what you are doing here is shifting your obligations of loyalty from God to the law. We maintain, therefore, Madison says, that in matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance. True it is that no other rule exists by which any question which may divide a society can be ultimately determined but the will of the majority. But it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority. The only way to preserve the freedom of every individual is to not subject individuals to majority rule. Civil society operates by majority rule. Unalienable rights cannot. And that's why it's unalienable. It is not subject to civil society. It is not subject to the will of the majority. It is not subject to the will of 2/3 of the majority, or 3/4 of the majority, or 80% of the majority, or 99.6% of the majority. The minute you operate in that kind of a framework, you are potentially discriminating against somebody. The only way to avoid it is to preserve religious freedom as an unalienable right, which means it can never be subject to the decisions of civil society. That is the very first of 15 arguments that Madison makes. It may be the most critical one, and that's my general conclusion. But what Madison is suggesting, what he's telling us here, is what unalienable rights mean. Basically, what we are, and I'm going back to Bob Kincaid's comments a few moments ago. Here in West Virginia, one of the pieces of legislation currently being considered in our legislature is a piece of legislation to allow people to carry a gun, to have a weapon, to carry, as the phrase goes, merely if they reach a particular age. They do not need a license. They do not need training. Everybody has a right, if this law passes, to carry a concealed weapon, provided they are old enough, in the state of West Virginia, if this law passes. Those who are defending this legislation are doing it in the context of the Supreme Court's decision in Heller, written by Justice Scalia. And Justice Scalia's argument that the right to bear arms is a fundamental right under the Second Amendment. In order to reach that conclusion, Justice Scalia had to eliminate the militia portion of the Second Amendment. We dealt with that in previous weeks when we were dealing with the Heller decision and the Stevens dissent against the Scalia majority opinion in Heller. But I heard on the news last night members of our legislature arguing in favor of this particular piece of legislation in Virginia by claiming that the right to carry a weapon is an unalienable right. That's the interpretation in the Heller decision. And it seems to me that this piece of legislation in the state of West Virginia right now is the logical conclusion of what Justice Scalia wrote in Heller. By making the case that the right to carry a weapon was a right under the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights, was an absolute right. What Justice Scalia did was open the door to this kind of legislation, which is, let's give everybody in this state the right to carry without any training, without any background checks, without the issue of license or anything else. Everybody will be armed. And of course, the logic that they apply to that is that if everybody's armed, everybody's safe. We'll see. But this is James Madison's first argument in this remonstrance, is that the Virginia Declaration of Rights declared that religion, or the duty that we owe to our Creator, and the manner in which we discharge that duty, can be only directed by reason or conviction, not by force or violence. If you believe that, if you believe that what man believes in terms of religion must come from within himself and cannot be imposed from any outside force, then you have to keep the state out of religion. The minute the state comes into it, you have an alternative source for truth other than your own conscience and reason. And that's Madison's argument for opposing this. So that's the first because. The second reason that Madison believes this particular legislation ought to be opposed is as follows: because if religion be exempt from the authority of the society at large, still less can it be subject to that of the legislative body. Period. In other words, if religion is an unalienable right, if it is not subject to the will of the civil society at large, then surely it can't be subject to the decisions of the elected representatives of society, of a legislature. It'd be one thing if all the people spoke in favor of it. But for a particular group of legislators to propose it and support it, to Madison, violates common sense. When he talks about the legislative body, he says, the latter, this legislative body, are but the creatures and vice-regents of the former. Legislatures are merely the creatures of society at large. Their jurisdiction is both derivative and limited. It is limited regard to the coordinate departments. More necessarily is it limited with regard to the constituents. The preservation of a free government requires not merely that the metes and bounds which separate each department of power be invariably maintained, but more especially that neither of them be suffered to overleap the great barrier which defends the rights of the people. The rulers who are guilty of such an encroachment exceed the commission from which they derive their authority and are tyrants. This last couple of sentences in number 2, I want to make sure we nail. I want to read this twice. The rulers, in other words, members of legislatures, who are guilty of such an encroachment of their legitimate limited power as representatives of the people, of society at large, exceed their commission from which they derive their authority, and they are tyrants. The people who submit to it are governed by laws made neither by themselves nor by an authority derived from them, and they are slaves. Madison is saying in number 2 that if civil society can't infringe on a man's religion, then certainly the elected representatives of civil society can't. And if members of a legislature choose to impose their will in terms of religion on others, they are tyrants, and those who submit to it are slaves. I don't think there's any way that Madison could make the case more clearly as to how significant he believes the state's intrusion into religion, into individual freedom, into the issues of unalienable rights is a violation of the basic constitutional elements of a republic. When government does this in the name of the people, they become tyrants. If the people don't have the right to impose their will on individuals within the society, then certainly those elected by the people don't have that right. And if they choose to use or to take that right, they are tyrants, and the people who submit to it are slaves. Pretty definitive. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so we may have time. Well, not 5 minutes left. We have maybe 3 minutes. I don't know if we have time for one more of these or not. Let's try this one, number 3. The third reason to oppose this particular religious bill: because it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens, and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution. The free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled the question in precedents. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. Madison's point here is you don't wait until all the cards are dealt. You see the implication to your freedom of what's happening, and you oppose it now. You don't wait until it gets established, until it gets settled, until it becomes acceptable legislation, and then try to oppose it. What you do is you see the implications at the beginning, you see the potential threat, and you oppose it at the very beginning. This particular legislation that we've been talking about here in the state of West Virginia, this Freedom Restoration Bill, has the potential to discriminate. Madison is saying here the mere fact that it has that potential is a reason to oppose it. Don't let it get established. Don't let it become settled. Don't let it become law. Stop it in its tracks. Madison said, "We revere this lesson too much soon to forget it. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. Once you allow this to happen, as minor as it seems, only 3 pence tax, once you allow this to start, you can't stop it. At the beginning, it supports all Christianity. But once you do that, you create the possibility of identifying specific groups within Christianity that are acceptable as opposed to those that are not. It's the nose under the tent idea. You can't let it get started, because once it starts, you can't undo it. You can't stop it. Those are 3 of Madison's arguments against religious legislation. Every one of those is an issue in the religious freedom legislation that is currently making its way through a number of state legislatures, including this one. I think that our legislature would do well to read this document and to understand it. Because Madison is waving his finger and shaking his head to this legislature and saying, you don't want to do this. You don't. I think we've reached the end of our day today. It's 59 minutes after the hour. So I think we'll save the rest of Madison's argument for our program tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow, Wednesday, we will be back at our regular time, 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and we'll have our full 2 hours together here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for tuning in today. I want to invite you to think about this and maybe give us a call tomorrow and let's talk about some of this stuff. This is Bill O'Brien, thanking you for supporting the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, inviting you to join us again tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening. Enjoy, be safe, be kind to each other, and hopefully we'll get together again tomorrow. Thank you.